Well, by the time I was 9 or 10, I was a earnest practitioner of ceremonial magic. And I would draw pentacles in my room and burn rosemary, and I was also an altar boy at this time. And it made some problems. I recall one time, I don't know how many of you are recovering Catholics, but there's a thing which they bring out once a year. I don't know if they still do this. They've sort of left the faith. But they have this thing which they use at midnight mass and Easter called an aspergillium, and it looks like a baby's rattle. And you put it in water, and it has holes in the round head, and it fills with holy water, and then you can fling holy water great distances with this thing. And so one day back in the sacristy, we were cleaning out some things, and the priest came upon this old aspergillium. And I said, whoa, he was about to get rid of it. And I said, whoa, I have a use for that. And he said, oh, what is your use for this, my son? And I said, well, I'm involved in the conjuration of Azael, the 11th general of the Mercuric sphere, and it launched an investigation that has made that town unsafe for the practice of ceremonial magic to this day. But the point of my story is they needn't have worried because, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but look, I'm paid to be controversial, you understand? So they needn't have worried because, at least for this lumpen Irishman, it didn't work. No matter how much rosemary I burned, no matter how many wax sigils were formed, no matter how many even more peculiar things were undertaken, it didn't seem to cut the mustard. And then, around the time that I was 14 or so, I had many obsessions. I mean, my life seems ruled by obsession. And at some point, I became aware that there was a book at the library that they didn't want me to read. This was when I was somewhat younger. And they didn't want me to read this book. And the librarian, who was friends with my mother, had been told, if he asks for this book, don't let him have it. So I not only determined to read the book, I determined to read every book the author had ever written. And the book was Brave New World, which I don't know how many of you have read it. It wouldn't stir a small wind these days, but it did involve, all the women did wear these prophylactic, some kind of, I never quite understood what it was, but it's some kind of birth control kit that they wore on the belt. And of course, people were grown in vats and had very free sex and so forth and so on. It was an interesting book, but then I started reading the author, Aldous Huxley. And I read Chrome Yellow, and I read Antic Hay, and I read After Many a Summer Dies the Swan, and I read Ape in Essence. And some of these things were like screenplays, and some were comedies of British manners. I kept hoping we'd get back to the prophylactic belt thing. And instead, eventually, I came upon The Doors of Perception and read this book, and it was like, it had never entered my mind. The concept of drugs, intoxication, information from reflection of that sort. I mean, the whole thing was just completely puzzling to me. And I can remember following my mother around the kitchen of our suburban home saying, if 1/10 of what this guy is saying is true, this is the most amazing thing in the world. Well, now we know that that's a very mild book, very limited in its claims. I mean, he talks about staring at the folds of his trousers and thinking about Hildegard von Bingen and It's basically presented as a thought thing, and most of you look like you're probably not old enough to remember, but there was a point in the evolution of awareness about the psychedelic experience where the way people did it is they piled up art books, favorite recordings, foods, perfumes, and then they would get loaded, and then they would look at the art books, eat the orange, smell the perfume. It's not a bad idea. But that was the clue to me, that there was something going on. And as I say, I was about 14, and I had a lot ahead of me before I really took my first trip. And I was trying to figure it out, shopping in the supermarket of ideas of the time, reading Camus, reading Nietzsche, reading Sartre, and all these people are a huge downer, as any of you know who've read them. I mean, the entire tone of modernity is just one big downer after another. You know, if it's not Hannah Arendt on the triviality of evil, well, then it's Karl Jaspers on something else, or Sartre, and it's just horrible, horrible stuff. Well, so I became aware through Huxley that there was this other possibility, and Huxley always wrote about the psychedelic experience as a branch of the mystical quest, what he called the perennial philosophy. And so I started reading both the scholars of mysticism, such as Evelyn Underhill and William James, Varieties of the Religious Experience, and so forth and so on. And I started reading the primary sources, Teresa of Avila, Thomas Traherne, Jakob Burma, what's the singing nut, Hildegard von Bingen, all of these people. And I got the idea that there was this experience, but I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it on my knees at the church for hour after hour. I mean, I found various forms of existential boredom ad infinitum, but and I would sit in nature, and I would hyperventilate, and I would do all these things. Well, the juice just wasn't coming. Well, to make a long story short, eventually, like lots and lots of people, and by my own personal route, I found my way to these things. And they are, to my mind, astonishing, worthy of taking risks for, because they work.